We are recreating an experiment the German psychologist Max Meyer conducted in 1903. You've now heard the same terrible piece of music 3 times. But if your experience was anything like the experience the original participants had, you should have been gradually revising your opinion of the piece in a positive direction in the second and third times that you heard it. In psychology, this phenomenon, the phenomenon of first hating something, but then coming to like it through repeated experience, is known as the exposure effect. Can we say a piece of music is inherently bad? Or are all such judgments purely subjective? Historically, this question has been addressed in terms of beauty. One of the big questions within the philosophical field of aesthetics is, can something be inherently beautiful? The classical philosophers believed in objective beauty. They believed a thing will be beautiful if the parts are organised to form a coherent whole, and if it accords to certain values regarding proportion, harmony, and symmetry. An example of an appealing proportion is the golden section, which is a point we're going to reach later in this lecture. The inference is that if you make something that adheres to these values, then beauty can be reliably achieved. The notion of objective beauty was discredited during the 18th century. The philosopher Edmund Burke formulated the following example to make the point. A swan has a very long neck. A medium-sized body, and a tiny tail. Burke asks, is this a beautiful proportion? It must be, because everyone thinks that swans are beautiful. But this is rather confusing, as everyone also thinks that peacocks are beautiful. And peacocks have got a pretty short neck, an average-sized body, and a tail which is longer than the neck and the body combined. Swan, peacock, swan, peacock, swan and peacock. Does that simply mean that there is no objective basis for our judgments? We're going to return to that question later, but let's now go back to the music that you heard at the start of this lecture. I composed that piece especially for this lecture. I tried to write a piece that has no inherent positive attributes. If I was successful, you should have experienced no pleasure the first time you heard it. But according to the exposure effect, you should have begun experiencing a little bit of pleasure the second time, and the amount of pleasure should have increased with each repetition. An interesting aspect of Max Meyer's experiment is that it raises the question, what constitutes bad music? I found it harder than I thought to compose a bad piece, a piece that would give you no feelings of pleasure. I began with the following proposition. Music is inherently bad when it has no order. I set about composing music on my computer by assembling unrelated musical ideas in a random way. I wrote a bunch of pieces and I played them to friends to get some feedback, but they told me the pieces weren't that bad, that they did perceive order and even a sense of cause and effect. I suppose the explanation is that our brains are wired up for and even construct a sense of cause and effect even when it's not there. Here's one of the pieces that I composed for the opening, but decided not to use. In that piece, I tried to compose musical ideas that lacked definition and identity, and which lacked noteworthy or memorable features. I also tried to make it unfocused and lacking in purpose. But I decided not to use it because I got really worried that the piece might in fact have a very strong sense of focus and purpose in expressing a state of confusion. After all, how can we tell the difference between a piece that is confused from a piece that has the aesthetic goal of expressing a state of confusion? As I listened to the various pieces that I'd written over and over again, I was also becoming increasingly fond of them. I realised that as composer, I was not immune to the exposure effect. I couldn't put myself back in the shoes of someone hearing these pieces for the first time. In the end, the one that I chose for the start of this lecture seemed to me the one that was just most clearly simply bad. I think it's bad by virtue of the fact that one can imagine that with some minor adjustments, it could sound good. In the end, the piece I chose is not bad because of its lack of order, its lack of memorable features or focus. It's just bad because it's incompetent. Another reason a piece might be inherently bad is because it's overly repetitive. In the field of psychological aesthetics, there is a concept called processing fluency, which refers to the ease with which information is processed. The ability to process information fluently gives us pleasure. In turn, a highly repetitive work produces a positive reaction. But this pleasure is short-lived, as once the listener understands what's going on, boredom sets in and a negative reaction results. This state of diminished interest is called habituation. David Huron proposes that highly repetitive musical works will be experienced positively if that repetition is offset with a small degree of variation. The next piece has got a large amount of repetition to engender the positive feelings that result from processing fluency, whilst I've also added a small degree of variation which should hopefully defer the negative reactions, the negative feelings that result from the onset of habituation. Another way that Huron suggests a composer can maintain listener interest with a minimum of compositional effort is through the occasional deployment of novelty. Within this highly repetitive context, a novel musical idea is now introduced at strategic moments to take care that you do not succumb to habituation. Let's now return to a state of pure repetition. Huron proposes that after a number of repetitions, listeners will habituate and in turn, responsiveness and pleasure will decline. On the face of it, that seems reasonable. But let's now consider this statement. Excessive repetition is an invitation to listen in. A purely repetitive work may lead listeners to a state of disinterestedness, but we can also imagine a listener who becomes highly interested in the way that the musical idea resonates in the space in which it's performed. Highly interested in the small details that the listener missed the first 10 times it was played, including the incidental sounds such as the guitarist's hand moving along the instrument's neck. This person might also tune into non-sonic aspects, such as studying the way that the musicians communicate with one another. Such a listener might note that in this context of extreme repetition, one element that sometimes changes is the facial expressions of the performers. A reflective person might also pause to appreciate the physical feat involved in performing such vigorous music over and over again. One of the notes in that melody may have caused a degree of irritation. The unexpected note choice is likely to have been surprising. The moment's not really bad, it's more puzzling. And although puzzling moments are often experienced negatively, they also have a positive potential since they attract our attention and interest. If the melody came back later in the piece, the puzzling deviation could be resolved, which in turn would give us pleasure. If a piece didn't resolve a moment of deviance, if it simply continued without any further reference to that deviance, then I think we could make a strong argument that the piece was bad, since this transgressive note was meaningless beyond simply being a moment of deviance. The note would be so puzzling that we might even conclude that the performers had made a mistake. That example also had a moment of deviance. The deviant moment here is much weirder. It was what we might call stylistic transgression. So far, we've considered the matter of bad music primarily from a psychological perspective. We've explored whether an understanding of our mental processes can provide an objective basis for our judgments. But the factors that shape our mental processes are much broader than we've acknowledged. We'll now look at why a piece of music might produce different reaction and what role context plays in our judgments. Imagine a continuation of that piece that attempted to reconcile this stylistic transgression. Attempting to make sense of that heavy metal confusion would indeed be an ambitious piece. If it pulled it off, that really would be something. But even if it did in some sense pull it off, there are still lots of people who wouldn't like it, no matter how good or successful it was. To explore this, let's now consider 3 hypothetical individuals.
My hypothetical name is Julia. I quite like the melody in that piece. But the inclusion of heavy metal was an immediate turn-off. I think it's too loud, too aggressive, and I associate it with satanic worship. I feel negatively about satanic worship.
My hypothetical name is Roger. I have made a deep and exclusive commitment to blues music. I think blues is the highest form of music because it is improvised, it is expressive, and it deals with personal woes in a harsh world. The idea of an instrumental piece trying to reconcile different styles of music just sounds bad to me. It has no lyrics, and it's not concerned with anything other than academic exercise. I believe music should be about the expression of feelings.
Most of Roger's friends are also blues enthusiasts, and their love of blues music is an important part of their social identity, pride, and self-esteem. In order to enhance our own sense of self-worth, we increase the status to which we ascribe to the group that we belong, which also involves discriminating against other groups. We divide the world into us and them through a process of social, or in this case, aesthetic categorization. We all do it.
My hypothetical name is Catherine. I don't like the idea of that piece because I believe in stylistic purity. I will concede that the whole idea of mixing styles was historically important during the heyday of postmodernism, but ultimately that was a dead end. Doing it now is just dated.
The exposure effect is a theory that tries to explain why we may positively revise our opinion of a musical piece. Huron believes that exposure alone does not provide the full explanation. He argues that we like music when it gives us pleasure, and that being able to predict what will happen next gives us pleasure. When we are unable to predict what will happen next in a musical piece, we don't experience pleasure, and in turn we don't like the piece. But if we hear that piece a number of times, we can learn to predict what will happen next, which gives us pleasure, and in turn leads us to change our opinion of the piece in a positive direction. To back up his argument, Huron proposed a thought experiment which I realised for this lecture. What you've just heard consisted of 5 short sound events. A, B, C, D, and E. Those elements were randomly ordered with 2 stipulations. The first was that A occurred far more frequently than the other sound events. The second stipulation was that every time D appeared, it was followed by E. So the order of the sound events was random, aside from this one condition, that whenever D appeared, it always led to E. Huron's argument is that if the degree of exposure was the most important factor in listener pleasure, then sound event A should have given you the most pleasure, as that was the element that you were most exposed to. You heard A 19 times, whereas none of the other sound events appeared more than 8 times. But Huron thinks that you wouldn't have received the most pleasure from A. He thinks you would have got it from E, as that was the only element that you could learn to anticipate. You could learn to successfully predict that every time you heard D, that E would come next. And the point is that this ability to successfully predict produces pleasure. It's a great experiment, but surely other factors are also at play. Perhaps you liked element C the best, because you thought C sounded cool, or because something in it reminded you of a song that you heard on the first date that you had with your current partner in a Thai restaurant. So we are now repeating the experiment again, with A, B, C, D and E, each represented by a single pitch. The same rules apply. A is appearing the most often. You can hear it now played by the violin. And whenever D appears on the synthesizer, it's always followed by E, which is played by the guitar. In this final part, we're returning to the opening music to create a rounded form. In his practical guide to musical composition, Professor Alan Belkin suggests that a rounded form can convincingly conclude a piece through providing a listener with a sense of stability, relaxation, and closure. This textbook view of composition taps into the values of proportion, harmony, and symmetry from the classical philosophers that we considered earlier. In creating a symmetrical relationship with the opening, I'm hoping to create a sense of tension between good and bad practice, as although the rounded form here might be good practice, the music is still bad. But in the end, can we say that this music or any music is bad? That's the question we posed at the start. And it seems from everything we've considered that we've got to conclude that evaluating music is a subjective act. And yet David Huron argues that musical pieces can be objectively bad. If we take this example of this opening music, Huron might argue, this music is objectively bad. Yes, you've come to like it, but that's simply because you've begun experiencing pleasure as you've become able to successfully predict what's going to happen next. That doesn't mean it's good. You're confused. This is a classic case of what psychologists call misattribution. What's going on here is that you are attributing the pleasure you received to the music, when really the award for the pleasure should go to the mental circuit that's formed in your brain, which has enabled you to make these successful predictions. That's a pretty amazing thought, and it's also troubling. For how can we distinguish between the pleasure that we get from good music and the misattributed pleasure that we get from bad music?